They weren't supposed to live. That was the unspoken judgment, passed before their first cries filled the air. Their eyes came out too far or too close together, their hands twisted in on themselves like the branches of an old, dying tree. And their mouths sometimes didn't even open properly. They were born in silence, in the dark corners of a country that never wanted to see them, not just because they were different, but because their very existence whispered a truth too uncomfortable to admit, that sometimes the monsters aren't born, they're made. For decades they were hidden away, tucked deep in the hollows of Appalachia, in the dust-choked plains of the Dust Bowl, in rotting wooden homes behind rusted gates that hadn't opened in generations. Their families had names but no histories, only whispers, only rumors, that they married cousins, that they kept it in the family, that when the world moved forward they stayed behind, and in staying behind, something went very wrong. This isn't a story about freaks. It's not even a story about poverty. It's about what happens when isolation, desperation, and shame fester for too long in the dark. It's about the children, the ones who didn't ask to be born into nightmares. Children whose deformities weren't just physical, but genetic echoes of choices made long before they ever opened their eyes. Some came from places so remote, maps forgot them. Others came from houses that once echoed with southern grandeur, but decayed into incestuous decay. Their birth defects weren't one-time tragedies, they were patterns, generational curses passed down like old family furniture, bent spines, missing ears, minds that never developed past infancy, and always those eyes, wide, lost, confused, as if they had glimpsed something they weren't meant to see. We found their stories in coroner's reports, in grainy black hair and white photos, in whispered interviews with neighbors who don't like to talk about what happened up on that hill. But the evidence is there, in the blood, in the silence, in the patterns that no one wanted to connect out loud. Tonight, we open the door no one else will. We look into the lives of the most inbred children of the 20th century, not to judge them, but to understand what made them, what trapped them, and what, if anything, could have saved them. There's a place in the Appalachian Mountains where time doesn't flow like it does everywhere else. The roads curl through the hills like veins through dying flesh, and some of the homes are so isolated that no electricity ever reached them, not because it wasn't possible, but because the families didn't want it or need it. They had everything they needed right there, a family name, a piece of land, and blood that stayed close. It's in places like these that the records start to disappear. No birth certificates, no school attendance, sometimes not even graves, just stories passed around like moonshine jars. Old Man Cleary married his cousin's daughter, the boy with the dog's jaw, that child who barked instead of spoke. You'd hear them late at night under porches when the air was still and heavy, and the worst part, they weren't all fiction. In 1952, a small county health inspector in Kentucky filed a report about a cluster of children born with identical abnormalities, fused toes, low-set ears, profound mental delays. The families refused to answer questions. They insisted it was God's will, but when he mapped out the family trees, something horrifying took shape. Cousins marrying cousins, brothers taking sisters, generations of looping bloodlines like a snake eating its own tail. These weren't accidents, they were patterns. Intentional or not, they had been allowed to form unchecked for decades, and the children, they were the end result of decisions made before their parents were even born. Children who couldn't walk, couldn't talk, couldn't hold a pencil, many couldn't even hold eye contact. Their bodies twisted under the weight of genetic overload. One nurse described a girl whose face looked like it was sliding off her skull. Another boy was born with such severe cranial deformities, his head needed to be supported by a brace from the moment he was delivered. No one wanted to say the word inbred. It was too ugly, too final, but everyone knew. And still, no one did anything. The counties were poor, the churches were protective, and the government absent. These families lived in a kind of quiet exile, and the children, They were simply accepted as part of the price, a price nobody would admit they were still paying. Not all of them came from the mountains. Some came from places far more polished, old plantation homes in the south where lineage was everything and secrets were the family business. You see, in certain families, the bloodline wasn't just preserved, it was protected. No outsiders allowed, no mixing, no dilution, just pure heritage, no matter the cost. There's a forgotten case from Mississippi, buried in probate records and sealed court documents. The child was born in 1939 to a woman who never left the house. She had no marriage license, no schooling, no public record of employment or even travel. But she gave birth to a boy with 6 fingers on each hand, a jaw so recessed he couldn't eat solid food, and an extra set of molars pushing through the roof of his mouth. The family, old money. A name tied to Confederate generals and railroad barons. They hushed it up, sent the child away for medical treatment that never came. Local gossip said the father was the woman's brother. Some claimed it went back even further, that the bloodline had twisted in on itself for generations, creating something brittle and warped beneath the surface. And this boy wasn't alone. Throughout the South, similar stories reappear, hidden between the lines of family Bibles and hospital records. Children born without limbs, infants whose organs developed outside their bodies. One family in Georgia had 4 children, none of whom ever learned to speak. The doctor who delivered the youngest refused to return, said there was something not right in that house, something unnatural. But what's truly disturbing isn't just the deformities, it's how easily these families buried them. Money bought silence, land provided isolation, and shame did the rest. No cameras, no headlines, just locked doors and drawn curtains, and behind them children raised in shadows, sometimes locked away, sometimes dressed up for church like everything was fine, but always hidden, always silenced. Their stories aren't told in textbooks, they're scattered like pieces of a shattered mirror. Letters written by nurses, whispered recollections by midwives who died before they could be interviewed, funeral records that list the same cause of death over and over, complications at birth. But complications don't happen the same way in the same families for decades, unless something deeper is wrong, something rooted in the blood itself. In West Virginia, deep in the coal-stained hills, there was a family people only referred to in hushed tones. No one said their name unless they had to. The few who remembered them still won't talk directly. They just shake their heads and mutter, "It wasn't their fault. Not really. And maybe they're right." The children had pale, bluish skin, at first glance almost ghostly. Their limbs were thin as sticks, and their movements jerky, unnatural, like puppets handled by an invisible hand. They didn't speak much, some didn't speak at all. But their eyes told you everything. Big, round, vacant, the kind of eyes that don't reflect light, only absorb it. The family had lived in the same hollow for over a century. No schools, no visitors, marriages arranged within, always within. First cousins, then second cousins. Then, when the gene pool dried up completely, siblings. The town knew. Of course they did. But in places like that where poverty clings to the bones and coal dust chokes the lungs, you mind your business. You don't poke your nose where it doesn't belong. Because if you do, you become part of the secret. A local teacher once tried to intervene. She noticed 2 of the children were nearly identical in their deformities. One had extra digits, the other had none, but their facial features matched exactly, like distorted twins born years apart. When she filed a report, the county buried it, said the family had a right to privacy. A month later, she left town without a word. The truth eventually leaked out in fragments. A photo here, a whispered story there. One child was born with no eyes at all, just smooth skin where the sockets should have been. Another had a cleft palate so severe he could barely breathe. Most died before adulthood, but a few lived and kept having children of their own. You might be wondering how it was allowed to go on, but that's the wrong clue. Question. The real question is why no one wanted to stop it. The answer isn't in the courts or the churches, it's in the silence, in the way people choose not to see what's right in front of them. These weren't criminals. These were human beings, damaged, yes, distorted by the sins of those who came before, but children nonetheless, innocent, and born into a world that had already written them off as monsters. Some of the children never knew the outside world existed. They lived their entire lives inside one house, one room, sometimes even one bed, kept out of sight, out of mind, like shameful relics that couldn't be destroyed, only hidden. And for the families that birthed them, it wasn't always cruelty. Sometimes it was fear, fear of judgment, fear of punishment, fear of what people might say if they saw what inbreeding had created. But what does it do to a child, knowing they're not meant to be seen? One boy in Missouri, born in 1946, never spoke a word. Not because he couldn't, but because no one ever spoke to him. His mother was also his cousin. His father was also his uncle. He had no last name, just a first name that wasn't written down anywhere official. When state workers finally found him in the early 70s, he was 24 years old. He had the mental capacity of a toddler. His hands were fused into fists he couldn't open, and the only sound he made was a soft, rhythmic moan, over and over. A sound that had become his language, his only way of being heard. Another girl, born in Tennessee, had a spine so curved she could never stand. Her limbs grew inward, looping like vines. Her family dressed her up in Sunday clothes every day, as if pretending could make it better. She never left the house. When neighbors asked about her, they were told she passed years ago, but she hadn't. She was still in that back bedroom, staring at the ceiling like it was the only sky she'd ever know. These aren't isolated tragedies. They're echoes, symptoms of a deeper sickness, one that stretches back across generations, where bloodlines were treated like fortresses, where the family name meant more than the child bearing it, where no one dared question what happened behind closed doors, even when the cries could be heard through the walls. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Because it's easy to say what should have been done, but when your entire world is one house, one family, one rule, we don't talk about it. Breaking free isn't just hard, it's unthinkable. The 20th century was supposed to be a time of progress. We sent men to the moon. We unlocked the code of DNA. We built cities that scraped the sky. But beneath all that steel and science, in forgotten corners of the country, something ancient was still rotting, and it was rotting from the inside out. There's a haunting irony in how far we advanced, and how far some families fell behind, not by choice entirely, but by consequence. When access to education ends, when poverty becomes generational, when religion is used as a shield instead of a light, isolation isn't just a lifestyle, it's a prison, and in that prison, blood is the only currency that matters. By the 1980s, social workers and health officials had begun connecting the dots. Rural counties with skyrocketing infant mortality, clusters of birth defects so rare they should have been statistical impossibilities. But the stories were always the same. Families refusing help, doctors told not to ask questions, and when they did, they were met with locked doors, blank stares, or threats. In one Arkansas town, a physician named Dr. Elridge documented over a dozen cases of severe congenital deformities tied to a single family line. He tried to raise the alarm. He sent letters. He called the state board. And then, just like that, he left town. His files were lost in a flood. His clinic was sold, and the family, still there, still untouched. The cruelty of inbreeding isn't always visible at birth. Sometimes it waits, it festers, mild facial asymmetry, learning delays, trouble walking, and then, slowly, it escalates. Children who begin to regress instead of grow, teeth that rot faster than they erupt, immune systems that fail without warning, and always, always, the isolation. The unbearable weight of being the child everyone avoids eye contact with, as if simply looking at them might bring the curse closer to home. What's most terrifying, though, isn't the deformities. It's how easy it was for the world to forget these children existed. No memorials, no documentaries, just blurry photographs locked in courthouse basements and scattered medical records stamped with the same quiet diagnosis: congenital anomaly. It's a term that sanitizes the horror, that strips away the human cost, but behind every case file was a child, a face, a cry that was never answered. In the end, most of their stories don't have endings. They just vanish. The children grow old, if they survive at all. Some die young, buried in unmarked graves. Others are institutionalized, renamed, erased. A few live into adulthood, cared for by aging parents who never leave the property, who never speak of what came before, and when those parents die, the house goes silent. There was a boy in Alabama, born in 1961. His mother was 14, his father was her brother. He had a cleft spine, a face that never developed properly, and a heart that barely worked. He lived 8 years. In those 8 years, he never went outside once, not even for sunlight. When he died, there was no obituary, just a short entry in a family Bible. God called him home. But the truth, God had nothing to do with it. We want to believe these are isolated incidents, that they only happen in the weird places, in backwoods towns we'll never visit. But America has always had its buried truths. Eugenics wasn't just a European horror, it was an American idea. At one point in the early 1900s, doctors and lawmakers here advocated sterilization for the feeble-minded. They believed some bloodlines should end. What they never considered was how those bloodlines got so broken to begin with. Inbreeding is not just a genetic problem, it's a societal failure. It's what happens when a community is abandoned, shamed, and left to survive however it can. When isolation becomes identity, when fear replaces education, when tradition turns into a noose. The most inbred children of the 20th century didn't ask for any of it. They were born carrying the weight of sins they never committed. They didn't get justice. They didn't get help. Most didn't even get names we remember. But maybe their stories are the warning we were never supposed to hear. Because when you trace the lines far enough back, through the hollers and the hills, through the broken homes and burned archives, you find something worse than monsters. You find people, forgotten, deformed, discarded people. And if we're not careful, we forget them all over again. If this made you uncomfortable, good. It should have. That means you're still human. Thank you for listening to what others chose to forget.